Bundle up and mark your calendars because Blue Door's signature event is back. Join us on February 22nd for Blue Door's coldest night of the year Richmond Hill fundraising walk sponsored by Home Trust. This is more than just a 2 or 5 kilometer walk. It's a chance to come together and make a difference. You can register, sponsor, volunteer, and fundraise in support of vulnerable individuals experiencing hunger, hurt, and homelessness in your community. For event details, visit cnoy.org/Richmond Hill. Let's change the tune for people in need because it's cold out there. Together, we can make a difference. See you on February 22nd.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome, Housers, to another episode of On the Way Home. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite, from the organization called Blue Door that has been working hard over the past 42 years and continues to do so, supporting our most vulnerable across York, Durham, and Peel region. We do that through a variety of different housing, health, and employment programs. Check us out at bluedoor.ca to see what the wonderful 130 people that are much, much smarter than I am are up to. And you can see all the wonderful things that are going on. Listen, if you have a guest in mind, if you have a subject matter in mind that you say, I think you should address on this podcast, or a panel, or a person, or you yourself want to come on, reach out to me at michael.b@bluedoor.ca. I would love to hear from you. Or if you just have feedback, right? If you don't agree with something that's been said on the podcast, you really like something that's been said on the podcast, please reach out to us at any time. We love your feedback. Let's get to today's guest. We have two amazing guests today. I think, when you talk about affordability issues across the country, and the GTA included in that, we've seen food insecurity soar over the last 5 years, right? And why is that? Why is that happening? Why now? And we're really seeing different people actually even accessing food banks across the country. We've seen the food bank usage triple and quadruple over the past few years. So we have two experts on today. We have Sahar Raza, who's the Vice President of Research and Advocacy at the Daily Bread Food Bank. And we have Richard Martern, who's the Director of Research and Food Banks at Food Banks Canada. We have a wonderful conversation. We learn a little bit more about them, how they got into this work, which is always fascinating. We hear a little bit about the numbers, what's happening with the food banks. They talk about, Sahar talks about how they used to, they were shocked when they went past 1 million users a year, and now they're way past 3 million users a year. Who's using the food bank, what they're hearing from people using the food banks. We talk about why this happened. So the bigger reasons, things like rent control, obviously affordability, and all these different things, minimum wage not keeping up, our social security blanket of OW and ODSP and all those different things. And then we talk about, hey, what has to change moving forward? It took a long time to get into this mess. We can't take a long time to get out of it. What can we change moving forward? We work through that. And of course, their hopes for the future. And with these two incredible individuals, doing the work they do, along with so many of you across our nation, I have no doubt better things are to come. It's a wonderful conversation with lots of huge, impactful information dropped. Let's go to that conversation now. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Richard and Sahar, so glad to have you here. You're doing incredibly impactful work and can't wait to share it with our listeners. Before we get to all that, we have to ask you the question we ask every person that comes on the podcast, and that is, what does home mean to you? Richard, we're going to start with you because, Sahar, you've already had practice at this, so we'll see if your answer gets if it's any different than it was before. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, home to me is, I was thinking about this, and it's somewhere that I feel safe, of course, somewhere which is close to where I need to be, whether it's services I need to access or places I like to be. And it's a place where I have personal agency, and I feel like I have some control over my life. All those things are important to me.
I love that. I love the person. No one's ever said personal agency. That's new, so that's great. Thank you for that, Sahar.
Yeah, I think very similarly, it's comfort, safety, and security for me. So, a place where I can be with my family and friends. It's my plants, it's a cozy bed, a place where you can dance around in your pajamas if you want to, or, where you have your favorite snacks stocked in the kitchen. And I think, really core to all of that is just this security that I know it's still going to be my home tomorrow. Like, I'm not at threat of eviction. My partner and I can afford our bills. And this work has just made me so conscious of how much of a privilege that is, which is so painful because this is a fundamental need. It's a basic human right. And yeah, it pains me that in a country like Canada in 2025, we haven't figured out how to secure that basic comfort for everyone. So.
Yeah, and far from it, right? I mean, we estimate, and it could be a lot larger, but about 250,000 Canadians can't realize the right to safety and dignity and comfort in their own home. Now, sorry, you have worked in the sector, kind of in the housing end of things, the policy end of things, and now are working more in the food security end of things. But take us on a walk of your journey into this work. How did you end up here? And then Richard will do the same with you.
Sure. I mean, I think social justice work in general is a bit in my DNA because not only was I a daughter of immigrants who faced all sorts of, challenges coming to Canada, but they were also advocates. So I quite literally grew up in boardrooms and courtrooms where I would hear them talking to community members and decision makers about injustice, racism, etc. And just to exemplify what that looked like in my childhood. I still remember in grade one, my class was celebrating Christopher Columbus Day. And I put my hand up and I was like, oh, my mom says that Christopher Columbus is an idiot who got lost and thought he found India. And I got in trouble. I got a call home and my mom just basically fist pumped me and then told all her friends. So that kind of explains naturally I would end
It's
up
a lot
in a
of
place
sense,
like
yes.
this. Yeah.
You got punished for being right. Come on.
It took the world a bit longer to catch up, but yeah. So yeah, that was about it. I took a bit of a winding route, like many people do, just studied math, tried to work in the private sector for a bit, did not resonate with me. Even tried to do social justice work through academia and research, but really wanted to do something tangible that would actually make an impact in the community. And so that led me to housing and homelessness, as you said, in the nonprofit sector. Had the privilege of leading national efforts to advance the right to housing in Canada. I even got to go to the UN and to sink my teeth into international human rights law, which has been really helpful in my work. And now I've landed my dream job at Daily Bread, where not only are we serving the immediate needs of people facing poverty every single day, but we can use those experiences and that data to drive forward evidence-based advocacy, which to me is the most powerful and the most human rights-based way to do advocacy. So really glad to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this as well. And so my background is social policy, and I did social work, the big field that involves social policy as well or is connected to. It's something I wanted to do right out of high school. It was sort of what I wanted to do from the beginning, and it was very much a visceral decision rather than a rational decision. I just knew that was the direction I wanted to head, and so I followed that educational path. Once I finished school, an opportunity arose, actually at Daily Bread, where Sahar is now, where there was a research coordinator opportunity where they coordinated this annual survey of volunteers, using volunteers to ask questions of food bank clients. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. But, and I said, well, okay, my background's social policy and it's a food bank. So I'm sure there's some way to weave into research skills into the food related questions and so forth, because I thought it would be food focused. But when I got there, it was actually very income policy focused and social policy focused, which was a surprise to me. And that's when I learned about the dual mission of organizations in our sector, like Daily Bread and then now Food Banks Canada, where I'm at now, where the key driving force of the need is around income policy and social policy. So it actually turned out to be more of my dream job than I even expected. But not only that, and as Sahar said, you're looking at, you're serving the immediate needs, you're getting to see and talk to people up front and see firsthand what's happening, but also look at the larger picture and see what's happening upstream that's driving the need. And using research and using data to help generate change and create awareness. And ultimately, that was, as I got more into the work, I realized how important that was, and it's becoming more important as the years go on.
Well said. Thanks for that. And Richard, if you could continue, tell me a little bit more about Food Banks Canada. What is the mission? What are you all about?
Well, Food Banks Canada, so the dual mission, it's at a national level, we work to relieve hunger today, and then help prevent hunger tomorrow. And we do this in collaboration with a network of over 5,000 organizations across the country. Daily Bread is part of that network, which is fantastic. And it's the relieving hunger today, that involves providing food and funds to the network to help increase local capacity. And that includes supplying grants for things like the equipment needed to store food and perishable food and fresh food, which more and more people are needing. And also providing funds for which to purchase food, which unfortunately more food banks have to purchase food to make up for fewer donations, and other resources to help increase capacity, while at the same time conducting research and which informs our policy recommendations. And we have a very active voice at the federal level, and more at the provincial level through our various channels. The research helps amplify when we publish, let's say, the Hunger Count Report, which is talking about the general need across the country. That's sort of the starting point, the entry point, where we talk about the greater need, and then we add on to that, okay, here's what we want to see changed from that. And that has been extremely important, as we're now at this real critical point in history, where we're seeing the highest levels of food insecurity in history, and more people struggling. And people are looking for not only information about what's happening, but realistic and implementable solutions, things that can be done, realistic solutions to help relieve this issue today.
Yeah, and I think we're going to dig more into that. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the solution isn't more food. And I've heard Neil Hetherington say that numerous times, right? Not that we want to, tell people not to give food. Absolutely not. But, you're talking about working upstream, and we'll get more into that. Sahar, tell me a little bit more about Daily Bread, because, I mean, both of your organizations have changed dramatically over the last, say, 5-10 years.
Yeah. And well, we're very similar to Food Banks Canada in that we have that dual mission, right? To work, it's specifically to collaborate with all, because we also know that we're Toronto based and we're sometimes punching above our weight, with federal advocacy and so on. So we really about collaborating with partners to end food insecurity in our city, but also advance solutions to end poverty more broadly. And we just recently, we used to have a value of human rights. That's actually become our operating principle. Basically everything we do, we try to embed with a human rights lens, a non-discrimination, putting clients at the center, and so on. And yeah, to your point, we've grown a lot in the last couple of years. We now have over 100 staff. We have about 7,000 volunteers every year who come through and help keep our systems going. We have about 130 agencies and 200 programs altogether across the city that are serving food insecurity in different ways. And of course we advocate. That's my role, right? The research and advocacy, taking all of that we see on the front line and making sure that it doesn't live and die behind the doors of a food bank, making sure the world hears what we're seeing. And then, as Richard said, advancing actual tangible policy changes that will make a difference in the short or medium term.
And the story of helping people in with food insecurity for years. I mean, it's always been, but it has really shifted since 2020. And I think in 2020 we saw, because of CERB, we saw that kind of come down to lower numbers. As Richard said, highest numbers ever now. Can you tell me a little bit, and Sahar, we'll start with you. What are you seeing right now across the GTA and country when it comes to food security and poverty, food insecurity and poverty?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll start with our food bank numbers. As you said, they're record breaking in the worst way. to your point, that we saw the numbers dip a little bit in 2020 because of CERB, and then they spiked to the highest ever. We hit 1 million food bank visits for the first time in 2021 when CERB kind of ended, and we thought, okay, it's not going to get any worse than this. And if you guys remember 2021, that was, everyone was talking about food banks and making donations and so on. But then just 2 years later, we hit 2 million visits. And then in the past 1 year, we hit almost 3.5 million food bank visits just in Toronto. So it's been this exponential growth just over the past couple of years. What that looks like on a daily basis, we're serving about 13,000 new clients every single month. So these are people who never thought they would have to come to a food bank, who are now coming to our doors because they just can't keep up with the cost of living. And, what housing has continuously come up as the main pain point for our clients, which I'm sure you would know working in the sector, and that's why we're here with this conversation. But yeah, the reality is that rent eats first, right? It's the one cost that doesn't flex the way that you can flex your grocery cost. If you only have $100, you can limit what you're buying. But with rent, to keep a food over your head, you got to pay what you're paying. And we're just finding that those costs are way out of control for people's incomes.
Richard, what do you see? Is there anything to add? I mean, I'm sure similar themes, but from your report that you just dropped to.
Oh, indeed. So what we've seen in the latest numbers, for the first time, we saw over 2 million visits in 1 month nationally. And that is almost double what we saw 2019 before the pandemic. And that amounts to about 1 million more visits in 1 month. And that is happening. At the same time, the food banks are seeing challenges with capacity. So in the past year, for instance, we saw a 6% increase compared to last year, 2023. But what we found is that 6% seems to be more indicative of what the network across the country can handle, as opposed to what the large need actually is. Because we did another survey concurrently to the hunger count survey, where we asked agencies, what issues have you potentially had around food shortages, and they said things like, well, 80% or more had to buy more food than they did the previous year, which is the most common way to adapt, because food banks will do everything they can to make sure people get the help they need, but they have to purchase to make up for those loss of donations. But many more said, well, we had to give out less per visit. And unfortunately, what we found is almost 30% ran out of food before the demand was met. And that's a noticeable jump from previous years. There's always some challenges around managing supply and demand, and the food bankers are experts at managing that very difficult to predict situation on the ground that can change on a dime for a variety of reasons. But this past year was noticeable in that many more were in that situation. But based on what we're seeing on the ground, as Sahar mentioned, new clients coming every day, every week. And it's just this relentless tide in the face of a supply that just no organization could keep up with that type of increase in such a short period of time.
No, and it must be, I mean, I can imagine it's like when you're telling people you don't have space in emergency housing or housing. I mean, just soul crushing to say, we don't have food for you. But so you're looking at a human being in front of you. Let's talk a little bit about that, Richard. What are you hearing from clients, and has the clientele who you're serving kind of shifted a bit?
Well, overall, what we're hearing is people feel in survival mode. They're feeling stuck. They're in survival mode. It's really the last few years, there's been successive crises, one on top of the other. First, you had the pandemic and the after effects of that, unemployment connected to the pandemic, and now it's affordability. So people are just essentially dipping in their savings to survive, especially the lowest income groups. So with some of the people we've spoke with, it's and even those, including those in the labor market, those who are working, they're working basically to survive. They can't even think about progressing. They can't even think about taking courses to upgrade. It's just a matter of trying to get food on the table today, and every day is a struggle. And that, the successive layers of, as I mentioned, affordability challenges, it's making people less resilient to potentially what could happen in the future. because of all these things that have been happening back to back. So what we've been seeing over the last few years, definitely an increase in the number of working people, people who are presently working and have to access the food bank. For years, it hovered around 10 to 12% of the food bank population. And then once 2022 hit and inflation hit, that number jumped to 14%. And now it's the highest ever at 18%. Even though inflation has cooled a bit, prices are still high. And there's still, of course, affordability challenges around housing and rental costs, for instance, last year was the highest increase that we've seen, in a long time, if not ever. So those two things together have shown a particular impact on working people, on households with children. That's increased significantly since before the pandemic. That constituted 18% of our clients before the pandemic, and now they're 22. More seniors who are on fixed incomes, many of the seniors in our clients are actually, they're renters, so they're going to be affected by challenges. Maybe seniors in the general population who aren't renters, it might not show in the general statistics that they're struggling or they're experiencing food insecurity, but those who are coming to us are dealing with the rent challenges in light of these fixed incomes as well, and utilities and utility costs. And then we're increasingly seeing more people who are, once they lose work, especially for recent newcomers, it's harder to access any benefits at all. So right now we're seeing the largest, those who are unemployed accessing EI is at its lowest level in history right now. And this is happening at the same time we're seeing the highest increase of clients with reporting no income for the month that we conducted the hunger count. And this is really telling because the social safety net's supposed to capture people when they lose work, and increasingly that's happening less. And what it means is that, food is a basic need, so they'll come to the food bank. So you're seeing things from two fronts now. So affordability challenges for those who are working, a lack of income supports for those who are not. And unfortunately, these two things are happening at a greater pace.
Sahar, anything to add to that? What are you hearing from clients? What are you seeing at the food bank? At Daily
Yeah,
Go?
I mean, very similar to Richard, but I think it's important to discuss the tough choices that clients are making too, because we also know that over 1 in 10 people in Toronto are now using a food bank, but a lot of people more than that are facing food insecurity, and you have to make so many difficult choices before you even end up at the doors of a food bank. So, people will skip their own meals to feed their kids. They'll give up their prescription medication to put food on the table. They'll sell their belongings, and as Richard mentioned, go into debt, exhaust all of their savings. And then that's when they're coming to the doors of our food bank. So they're just in that emergency need level where they have nothing left. They've already relied on friends and family. They've done everything that they can. And that's why in this year, we have an annual Who's Hungry report. We called it Trapped in Poverty, because when people get to this point, they just get trapped in it. And the stats, even like Canada-wide, show more people are falling into poverty than they are exiting poverty. So there's something broken here where people are just getting stuck in it. And again, as Richard mentioned, we're seeing a lot of new demographics that we haven't seen before. So people are reporting higher employment rates than ever before, higher wages, higher work hours. Almost 50% of our clients have someone in their house who's employed. They're working an average or median of 35 hours a week at $18 an hour. So that's almost full-time over minimum wage. You're still having to come to the doors of our food banks. So clearly something is broken here. And then just to tag on to what Richard said as well about we're seeing a lot of newcomers. We're seeing young working age people. Of course, people on social assistance, that's always been the case. But there's a lot to say about just all the systems that have have kind of come to a head at this point and broken down, that is like causing this bleeding in Toronto.
And what a beautiful segue. Our next question is that, and it seems silly to ask because there's a lot of things that are obvious, but over the last 5 years, what has really changed for 2-3 million visits a year? You're tripling service. What are some of the big shifts? People are always looking to blame too, right? You see people trying to blame the influx of newcomers, or this has happened, and they blame government, or different things that are happening. What is happening? What has happened over the last while that really has made a major impact into the skyrocketing use of food banks? Sahar, we'll start with you, then go to Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core of food bank use has always been income is not keeping pace with the cost of living. I think, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily something that happened in the last 5 years. I think the cost of living crisis that we've seen in the last 5 years is decades in the making, under investments in social and affordable housing dating back to the 80s and 90s, under investments in healthcare, in our post-secondary institutions, and so on, like these critical infrastructure. And then we just saw it all come to a head during the pandemic. And now it's just, that was basically the last domino that tore our social safety net open, I think. But, some really specific policy things that have happened in the last 5 to 6 years. Ontario created a rent control exemption. And what we've seen is, at the time when they did that, they said, okay, there's going to be no rent control on units after 2018. And this will, spur construction and eventually create affordability. As we've found, and we've reported in this year's report as well, construction went down and rents went up, right? So it failed on both accounts. Then there's income supports for people who lose employment. Ontario Works, that's been frozen since 2018 at $733 a month. So just imagine you lose your job, and even trying to get through a single month on $700, like, you're not going to be able to pay rent or do anything, meet your basic needs. There's been grocery and food inflation that hit, over 10% in inflation over the last couple of years since the pandemic. And then, just wages not keeping up, right? Like, minimum wage went up to maybe $17 in Ontario now. I mean, our clients are already making more than that, and they're still coming to food banks. So it's not adequate.
Yeah. Well, I read recently in the Toronto Star, they were saying that they're looking at what you need to afford a one-bedroom apartment across Canada and the GTA. I think in Toronto it was $37 an hour. So you think of that $20 wage gap, right? It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, your thoughts? What are some of the biggest kind of movements that have really pushed us to where we are now?
Well, to touch on what Sahar was saying too, and reinforcing it, we're talking decades of social policy neglect, especially when you're looking at social assistance. And this is not just Ontario, it's across the country. In some cases, rates have fallen behind in real dollars what they were worth over 30 years ago. And it's some provinces, or maybe more provinces than before, are trying to take steps to increase those rates, but it's very difficult to catch up to that loss of purchasing power that's happened for both people on general welfare or on disability. So that is a key thing. And in addition to that, there's been this significant lack of attention to those who are working, people who are in the labor market, who are employed, but any help for them is almost non-existent, or if there is help, they're not aware of it. Or right now, as the case may be, they're making technically too much income to qualify for these programs. So lack of attention for those in the labor market, the working poor. And all this came to a head, of course, as we're now seeing when we have the combination of the ending of the pandemic-related supports in 2021 and then the surge of inflation in 2022. Those successive events really brought these shortcomings to the fore. And we're seeing it even more clearly now with the recent unemployment or high unemployment rates among recent newcomers. So unemployment in general is now starting to tip upwards again. And then among recent newcomers, it's much higher than the rest of the population. And that's what's actually magnifying this lack of support for those in the labor market, a lack of coverage for EI that we've been calling for change for years, and that advocates have been calling for change in years, is greater EI coverage to encompass people who are in the casual or seasonal work hours situation, and that's more of the labor market these days. So those two things happening at the same time, the ending of the pandemic benefits, surge of inflation, and a social safety net that's pretty much been left alone for years and decades left to, it's been decaying. And those who are disproportionately affected, we're seeing in all the indicators. So racialized groups, Indigenous groups, people with disabilities, single working age adults are all being disproportionately affected by these policy gaps.
Can I just jump in there,
Of
Michael?
course, yeah.
Because what Richard was saying also made, and you also mentioned, a lot of people are blaming newcomers, and I think there's something to be said about immigration policies as well that have really shifted in the last couple of years to to prioritize temporary migrants instead of people who have permanent status. And that makes them even more vulnerable to not be able to access social assistance. You can't access EI, they don't get good jobs. And there's a whole host of human rights violations and wage gaps that we see amongst temporary migrants, like international students and so on. So just wanted to articulate too that I think that's that's not the cause. They're actually amongst the most affected because of some of those policy changes.
100%. And you both mentioned this decades in the making, but we know we don't have decades to turn this around. We've got to turn this around quickly because so many people are suffering. What has to change moving forward to really see those numbers? And no offense to put you both out of business. Wouldn't that be great? What has to change for that to happen in the next while? Richard, we'll start with you.
Well, the key things that we're calling for this year, similar to what we've been mentioning the last couple of years, is a dual approach where we have to first address some of the long-term challenges that are happening and addressing the decades of social policy neglect through increasing affordable housing, increasing EI coverage, reforming our social safety net so people on social assistance, or whether they're working on social assistance who are low incomes, can have a building block that brings them to this basic level of income. We know that doesn't happen overnight. There's debates that have to happen in Parliament. There's initiatives that have to be put forward, but we're going to continue to call for them. And there have been some commitments made, and important ones, but we have to keep going in that direction. However, there's also the immediate affordability challenges that have to be addressed now, as you mentioned. And that's why we're advocating heavily for the updated version of the GST credit, known as the Groceries and Essentials benefit. So that is one key thing we're advocating for, which will deliver money immediately into the pockets of low-income households struggling to afford food. And then related to housing, addressing this ignored area of those who are currently in market rent housing and who are struggling to pay their rent now. Looking for an expanded rent assist program from the national level that could help people who are living in market rent housing better afford their rent, based on the model they have in Manitoba, which has shown some success in that regard. And we see a national level of that potentially being very effective, not only addressing current affordability challenges, but also perhaps part of a longer term reform of our social assistance system. So in addition to that, ways we're amplifying that is through our research, through our publication of the hunger count and mentioning what we need to see changed. We have our policy report cards that have been launched, and that is one way we're tracking provincial, territorial, and federal governments on the progress they're making on their commitments, or lack thereof in some cases, and say this is what you need to do to see a change, and so provide some ongoing transparency and accountability. And then we've proposed a new way to measure poverty, because right now, when we look at the official poverty measures, we're still showing that poverty is still officially lower than it was before the pandemic. But our numbers don't reflect that. Food insecurity rates don't reflect that. So our team at the national level have proposed something called a material deprivation index, a complementary measure of poverty that looks at the standard of living people are experiencing today, and hopefully a complementary reflection and a better reflection of the extent of poverty we're seeing in our country. So that's what we're doing in a nutshell, is we're trying to work on various fronts, whether it's calling governments to task on poverty reduction, suggesting new ways to measure it, and then creating more public awareness to make sure the public is aware, continues to be aware of what's happening.
Thanks for that, Richard. Sahar, what anything to add? Like, what needs to change? What do you think? What are your when you're doing your advocacy work, what are you pushing for?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about yet is we also saw a huge increase in homelessness amongst food bank users or clients this year, which is very new for us because frankly, we give groceries. So you don't usually see a lot of folks experiencing homelessness come to those kinds of services. They'll go to our meal programs, not our food banks. So what that tells us is that, of course, housing is the main pain point. And that's what we heard directly from our clients when we did our Who's Hungry survey this year. So that's a huge one. We just need to invest in more social and deeply affordable housing. I mean, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation put out a report this year saying that there are statistically 0 units that would be affordable to people, 20% of Torontonians with the lowest incomes. Like, they know it, but the policy isn't changing to reflect that need. So clearly we need to make a change on that front. I think we need real rent control. I think the data shows this exemption has been a failed experiment over the last 6 years. Let's try actually implementing rent control and seeing what happens, right? Maybe rents will stay down. And I think we need to see just generally public funds spent in a way that ensures public good, like a lens to human rights and putting people first. I think we've tried for decades this trickle down thing. Maybe if we ask the private sector nicely to do something good, maybe they'll do it, or let's leave it to charity. Like it's not working. We need our governments to step up in their human rights obligations and actually take these basic needs seriously and put them at the forefront of their decision making. And so when it comes to what we're doing, I mean, we're mobilizing on a lot of these issues. As I mentioned, we try to focus on short and medium term because we know these are people coming to our doors every day who need solutions now. We can't wait 10, 20 years for something to happen to improve their lives. So, there's like small policy things. Like, I don't know if you folks knew, I mean, Richard, you would know for sure, but if somebody's receiving ODSP or Ontario Works and then they become homeless, they lose the housing component of their benefit. Like, that's just a nonsensical policy thing, which, like, how are you ever supposed to get out of homelessness if you became homeless on those poor rates in the first place? So, like, raising things like that I think sometimes even our own politicians are not even aware is happening. We did a huge campaign last year on the Canada Disability Benefit. We really tried to mobilize partners from across the country, disability organizations, because we know that a quarter of our clients have a disability. So this would make a huge impact on the front lines of food banks. And remarkably, we got over 27,000 people to write letters to their politicians calling for a Canada Disability Benefit. As a coalition, sent over 100,000 letters. And it was budgeted last year. So like that's historic. Of course, government always gives you 20% of what you asked for. So it's not enough money, and we're still pushing on that. But that's in a nutshell what we're doing, identifying those things that we can make a change on right now, and just mobilizing everyone in our network to actually push forward those common sense policy changes.
Yeah, so much in both of what you're saying. I know that in Toronto recently, they had a program that would help people with home ownership, and they were calling it the Affordable Housing Program, and they're looking at changing it to attainable housing, because even when they're helping people with that down payment, they're not qualifying for the mortgage because incomes just aren't there, right? They can't do it. So they're changing those programs up so it becomes a different program altogether. We're seeing in Ontario, the provincial government has done a number of things, from what you talked about around rent controls, which have been a bit of with intentions of maybe this will cause building, but also things around legislation not allowing municipalities to kind of add to their building supply or work with developers to get those affordable units. So they're not able to do that anymore. I was talking to a mayor yesterday who said we just kind of ask and hope now. We have no real levers to pull. And then as well with this new talking about using the non-withstanding clause, right? We're going to have a panel on that, come on the podcast to break that down. But to push people out of encampments with not a mention of housing and the real problem of why they're there in the first place, right? So there's a lot of work to do, but this is a hopeful podcast. We have brilliant people like the two of you doing awesome work, working with awesome teams, doing great stuff. I myself have worked with a lot of people much, much smarter than I am, thankfully. We can do this. What are your hopes for the future? Richard, we'll start with you and then go to Sahar.
Well, in short, a Canada where no one goes hungry is a hope for the future. But the continued reform of our social safety net, rebuilding our social safety net, addressing the affordable housing crisis, support for low-income workers, and universal benefits for those, including, we've made progress with the dental program, but also pharmaceuticals and medications for people who need them, regardless of whether they're in the workforce or not. All those things together is my hope for the future, where we see a real concerted effort to close these gaps in our social safety net that have been breaking wide open for too long, and that we see a Canada where people need to get the help that they need once times get tough.
Amazing. Sahar, what are your hopes?
Well, as you know, Michael, I'm expecting my first daughter. You're expecting your first grandchild, I think. So, I hope that they can look back when they're our age and say, wow, things are so much better. We don't even have food banks anymore, broadly speaking. I hope that's where we get. And I think, nitty gritty wise, it looks like governments, stop playing politics, stop trying to win the next election or best your opponents. Like I would really hope to see our governments think about long-term solutions that will outlive their tenure in leadership, because that's just the right thing to do, and actually put people at the center. Like, to your point, not the notwithstanding clause is just like that use of that to evict encampments, the most horrific violation of basic human rights. I hope we move past that type of thinking in our communities. I hope that we see a fully funded Canada disability benefit. The fact that we're legislating people with disabilities to live in poverty is just horrific. And if any of us were in a situation where we couldn't work, I'm sure we would want to have at least $2,300 a month. Like, that barely covers rent, but I don't think that's too much to ask. Social assistance rates more broadly above the poverty line, like just realistic policy thinking about what it takes for someone to get back on their feet and live a thriving, dignified life. I'm not really seeing that right now, but I do have hope that there's so many fantastic people doing important work in all of these sectors. So yeah, I hope that we can create a world where food insecurity is this rare, brief, non-reoccurring thing, that we have a robust social safety net to prevent.
Yeah, the obstacles are big, but we've got to start taking, I think, bigger swings, right? I think I people are tired of hearing me say this, but we have this kind of good enough attitude sometimes in Canada. We're like, oh, food bank, can of food, done my part, right? Or when it comes to homelessness, they'll send me something. Look at this awesome, like, full year-round sleeping bag that I'm like, is that? And the answer, or the question I always ask people is that good enough for your mom or your kid or your brother? Is that what you would say if they came to you and said, I'm hungry, I'm houseless, and the answer is always, well, no. Well, then it's not good enough, right? So we've got to get past this good enough. I drop the line always in the BlackBerry movie when he's pushing one guy to develop the BlackBerry faster, and he says, that perfect is the enemy of good, and his response is my favorite. He says, good enough is the enemy of humanity. And I think that is the enemy of humanity, because we just get the good enough. Blue Door runs programs, right? Wonderful programs, faith-based, where people come in from the cold and they get some love and food and nourishment and sleep for a night, but then they're out at 7 a.m. And people deserve more than that. They deserve a key to their front door, a dignified way of living. Every human being deserves that. And we don't stop there. It's a start, but we can't stop there, right? And we have to get past that good enough. And I believe that we can get to great with individuals like yourselves doing the work that you're doing, and so many across this country doing the same. Listen, if people want to find out about the work that you're doing, they want to donate, they want to be part of the solution, where can they go? Sahar, we'll start with you.
Or yeah, well, I'm from Daily Bread Food Bank, so you can go to dailybread.ca. We always appreciate volunteers and donations, but we also, I think this whole conversation has made clear, we know every food bank visit is a policy failure at the end of the day. So we have all sorts of campaigns as well on our Take Action page. You can write to your politicians. And if I can plug a separate campaign, fundthebenefit.ca. That's our coalition's website where we're pushing for the Canada Disability Benefit. And it would be amazing if everyone could go and write a letter to their MPs. Yeah.
Incredible. Awesome. Thank you for that. Richard?
Yeah, so I would say, from Food Banks Canada, go to foodbankscanada.ca. Look at, connect with your local food bank in your community and see what you can do to help. In the case of Toronto or the GTA, of course, there's Daily Bread, there's North York Harvest, there's York Region Food Network, Mississauga Food Bank. So check out the local food bank in your area. But of course, Daily Bread produces amazing reports as well. So look at the reports produced by our organizations, whether it's Daily Bread, Feed Ontario, Food Banks Canada. We're all sharing different perspectives, aligning though on the general overall message, but we're sharing different viewpoints on what's happening, and I think they're extremely informative. People can learn more about the issues, connect with their local MPP or MP and ask them what they're doing to change the situation. Follow the policy recommendations. We have numerous, but key one is the groceries and essentials benefit. Also the Canada Disability benefit that Sahar is mentioning. Just see what you can do to both help on the ground with the need today, whether it's donating your time or food or funds if you can, or kind of connecting with your local member of parliament or member of provincial parliaments and asking what recommendations they're going to implement of ours.
All very doable things. Go to both of these websites, help out with these crucial organizations. Be it, I would say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So, and both Sahar and Richard, you guys make it so easy for people to advocate and be a part of that. I mean, just simplify it too. There's no excuse. Go to the websites, and be an advocate, give back, continue to do that. Thank you both so much for the work you do day in, day out to fight that battle of changing social policy and making this world a better place. It's so appreciated. And thank you for your time today. Sahar, good luck with your new adventure in parenthood.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good luck with grandparenthood.
Thank you. We'll see you guys next time on The Way Home.